Okay, this lecture is regarding urbanization. Obviously, we know urban refers to cities, and for the purposes of this lecture, the definition of a city is a permanent settlement which actually has little or no ability to create food for the population that lives in it. And again, very basic definition, and certainly human beings have lived in cities throughout human history. Most of the major cities that exist in the world got their starts as cities in either agricultural or some of the very ancient ones, even pastoral horticultural societies. So cities are not necessarily just associated with the Industrial Revolution. So again, we talk about some of the great cities of the ancient world, places like Athens or Rome, or in Western Europe, London, or around the world, and places like Peking or any of these large cities. We definitely know that they were places that grew up largely as centers of trade, but for the most part, food is produced out in the rest of the society and imported into a city environment. But it was definitely the Industrial Revolution that drew many more people into cities. In agricultural societies, the majority of the population would be found in rural or agricultural areas with few punctuated cities around. Again, usually major centers of trade or ports, those kind of things. But when the Industrial Revolution and the advent of mass production, especially factories in the early stages of the Industrial Revolution, that drew many more people into cities, basically to participate in the workforce. So that led to a process of urbanization where more and more an increased percentage of the population becomes centered in cities. And this also then gives rise to larger and larger cities with more and more and more influence. So as opposed to, let's say, a city like 16th century London, which was basically the remnants of an old Roman fortified city, which was basically largely self-contained within a walled area, and production occurred in there, but was largely a center of trade. Then we started to see urban areas becoming much, much larger and exerting a lot more influence over the surrounding areas, resulting in what we sometimes refer to then as metropolises. So not just the city center itself, but exerting a lot of influence over a region. Sometimes the smaller cities that are around it kind of become enveloped in it. Certainly we can look at the kind of the concept of the 5 boroughs of the city of New York as being a good example of a metropolis. So whether or not we consider Manhattan, Brooklyn, the Bronx, Staten Island all to be different cities, when we talk about the combined metropolis of New York, we're talking about all these different areas combined together. And even as cities have continued to grow and more of our population has been concentrated in cities, then we've seen the rise of megalopolises, which is that idea of sometimes these very large metropolises then have overlapping areas and in a sense kind of combine to form what we call mega cities. At one time, again, New York City was probably considered the best example of a metropolis growing into a megalopolis. There's as many as 15 to 20 megalopolises that exist around the world now. In the United States, probably the best and biggest example, if you think about the east coast of the United States and look at basically a map of the United States, you can think of basically the entire almost northeast corridor stretching from Boston all the way through Connecticut to New York City, through New Jersey to Philadelphia, to then northern Maryland and Baltimore, through to Washington, D.C. For all intents and purposes, we could consider that a megalopolis, one entire urban zone. So even though there's lots of different, and there's certainly thousands and thousands of small towns and cities that live in there, and certainly suburban areas, it's basically one urban corridor that exists basically all the way from Massachusetts to Washington, D.C. And that's a pretty good example of a megalopolis. In the U.S., approximately between 75 and 80% of our population lives in cities. There's certainly a lot of migration that occurs between the cities, especially in areas like I said, connected closely to one another. Some of the characteristics of city life, there's definitely can be arguments made between, again, some of the positive and negative perhaps aspects. Certainly many people point to a large rise in the feelings, kind of alienation among individuals who live in large cities. That is a sense of disconnect, sometimes what we call city attitude, or kind of a hardness that arises among people who basically just kind of feel disconnected from the other people. Sometimes you can think about it from as kind of a defense mechanism, become too wrapped up in too many other people's problems, especially when people have to live in very close environments with each other. And certainly the flip side to that is pointing toward the very positive sense of community that many cities bring, in which individuals can sometimes go to find belonging with other people who have very similar interests or lifestyles, or as they do. Sociologist Herbert Gans in 1962 kind of broke down what he described as maybe the 5 different types of people who dwell in cities. And again, he was focusing on certainly American urban life. But he talked about different types of people who live in cities. One, he talked about cosmopolitans. These are, again, people we might consider to be more upper class, but certainly intellectuals, professionals, people who appreciate the cultural benefits that living in a city can offer. So whether or not it's a closeness to other people, again, who share the same interests, or things like the presence of museums or symphonies, or other type of again, cultural activities, he described as cosmopolitans. Certainly cities attract a large number of people who are single in their lives. Generally, we tend to think of these as younger people in society, maybe people in their 20s and 30s, who often go to cities for the purposes of convenience, as well as mingling with other people, and enjoy generally the nightlife that a city has to offer as far as being able to entertain themselves. Gans also described what he called ethnic villagers, because we know that cities are major areas of influx of immigrants. Most people who immigrate to cities, or most immigrants to other societies, usually enter those societies or cultures through cities. And then very often ethnic groups in a particular area will cluster together and form ethnic communities or neighborhoods. So once again, speaking about New York, or most urban areas, we can say when we look at the presence of Chinatown in certain areas, or Little Italy, or different type of ethnic neighborhoods, those are places where people coming into those cities can group for the purposes of protecting and supporting one another in this new society. Gans talked about those people who are deprived. So many people obviously in urban areas are not always thriving. These may be people who were brought up in an urban environment at a disadvantage, who for one reason or another feel that they can't escape, and sometimes refer to kind of the idea of the urban jungle. So again, very poor people brought up in urban areas who don't feel like they have the ability or resources to leave. And then he also refers to those that he considered the trapped. Again, kind of very similar to deprived, but instead of being born in the urban area and not being able to leave, these may be people who came to the urban area and were unsuccessful, and maybe started in a higher group, but experienced a lot of defeat or kind of spiraling downward, and then find themselves unable to leave the area that they're in. We can also talk about some of the other challenges that face urban areas and urban problems. Certainly, we can definitely talk about the spread of cities, and we definitely know that as cities become larger, even growing to the area of metropolises, then usually around those cities we call suburban areas. And we can definitely see, when we see movement from the cities to the suburbs, which was clearly a trend that occurred in the middle of the 20th century, where cities arose very quickly during the Industrial Revolution, and then we saw a huge outflow, but not back into rural areas, but the advent of these large areas around cities, which are called suburbs, and there was definitely a movement from there. We definitely saw a lot of the effects of that, where even though the populations of cities got big very quickly and then flowed out to the suburbs, shrinking tax bases, we definitely saw large effects. Sometimes when we talk about the plight of inner city schools, we can point to tax base leaving city areas and with no way to replace it. A lot of cities experienced a lot of infrastructure deterioration during this time. So buildings and things like subways and bridges and things like that without a base suffered quite a bit. And again, we talked about this kind of idea of urban decay as being a result of suburbanization. However, we've definitely seen now, and we'll talk about urban revitalization in just a minute, but when we actually now talk about people, and we see more of an influx of maybe people out of suburbs back into urban areas, we then sometimes refer to gentrification, the idea of a lot of cities experiencing kind of a renewal and regrowth, where people are moving in and revitalizing, which may have been areas that were affected by this movement out of the cities decades ago. So movement of the middle or upper classes into poor neighborhoods, which sometimes is looked at as a positive thing when we look at urban development, but can also be a disadvantage to the people who historically live in those areas, who may then find that they're unable to afford rents or mortgages in that area and often become displaced. So when we talk about this idea of urban revitalization, there's often many different ideas or plans for how to kind of revitalize or renew a city. We can definitely talk about urban renewal, which is definitely kind of just almost burning clear, just ripping down, tearing down, rebuilding, which again can often displace many people who live there. There's certainly been in a lot of cities efforts to establish what are generally called enterprise zones. So that idea that a city will welcome or entice businesses into a specific area, often through things like tax breaks or other incentives to try to establish businesses. One of the biggest obstacles a lot of times that cities have found is that nothing's been done to address especially high crime rates in cities, that those enterprise zones often fail because it's not addressing the idea of lifestyle or standard of living in a specific area. Basically, the most effective urban renewal plans have definitely recognized that it's necessary to make a city attractive to people, is to make city living itself attractive by offering lots of different, as we discussed before, cultural advantages, emphasizing some of the reasons that perhaps people like cosmopolitans and singles would find city areas enticing or attractive and enhance those, but also that some of the most beneficial urban renewal projects have focused on trying to make the standard of living in urban areas accessible to everybody, not just the privileged classes at the top.